welcome. I say welcome several times. So I've given myself a really easy task today because we're only about I think it's 8 verses. We're going to look at 8 verses, and we looked at a couple of them at the end of last week. So there's a bit of a crossover, bit of a transition. And it's the feeding of the 5,000, which is a story we all know so well. So it's in one sense I've given myself this easy little kind of little unit, but hopefully it'll be interesting just to kind of see some of the discussions, some of the things that go on in the mix. So yeah, there we go. Matthew 14. Oh, it says 1 to 14. That's incorrect straight away. It's actually from 13 to 21 is what it should be, which is what it says at the bottom. If you look at the bottom, hang on, there it is, just there. It says there. And Jesus, having heard. So if you remember last week, he's tried to withdraw. So having heard, he withdrew himself by boat to a secluded place by himself. So Jesus is trying to get away, and part of the context is important because it kind of throws up. It's not really a big controversy, but it throws up a little bit of a kind of a debate or an argument. He's trying to withdraw from the crowds, but on hearing, they followed him on foot. So they're presumably from Jesus starting in Capernaum. Was it Bethsaida, I think? He's trying to kind of move away. He's got in a boat, but they can see the boat, and so they're heading around the coast trying to keep up with him. So he gets out of the boat, but as he presumably he settles where he wants to settle, the crowd starts to come round. Takes a bit longer by foot, and come up, and he's moved with compassion towards them, and so he healed their sick. So we're seeing the beginnings, and of course the feeding of the 5,000, it should just be said, is one of, outside of the final week, is one of the few things I think that is actually recorded in all four Gospels. Some people say it's the only thing. It's not. There are a couple of other things, but they're often the incidents are often only a single phrase or a single sentence. So I think, for instance, all four Gospels refer to Jesus kind of relocating to the south. That hasn't happened yet. Jesus is still based up in Galilee at the moment, but there are a few things like that which are recorded in all four Gospels. So anyway, he sees that great crowd, and they come up, and he healed their sick. So there you go, new little got a nice new little graphic. So I just thought it's just worth touching because we know the story so well. And I didn't really realise until I started to think about this week that there was actually a controversy of where the feeding of the 5,000 happened. Because I've always understood it to be where I've got it on this map here, feeding the 5,000, or around that side. I wouldn't have put it as precisely, but now I understand from an archaeological point of view why actually it's a very good situation. It makes the most sense of the text. So if you think about the text, you remember we're going to be looking at Matthew's Gospel, and his is the tightest text. I've always maintained through these sessions that Matthew is written first. But one of the reasons that sometimes people make for saying they think Matthew's written after Mark and Luke is that Matthew's often descriptions are very thin, and so the argument is he assumes that people have already read Mark, and they assume that he's already read Luke, and therefore he comes along and leaves out the details. You see, and so you hear the argument like that, and it sounds like, oh, that makes sense, because it does. That's how I was kind of taught these things. I remember years and years back. Yeah, that makes sense. People know the details of the story, so he just kind of gives you the bare bones and outline. But the funny thing is, it's really interesting because it helps kind of understand how the same facts can lead to very different conclusions. Because actually, the same argument can be made the other way around, which is the position I now take, if Matthew is actually written very close to the events, if it is the gospel that is generated out of the development of the apostles' teaching, which happens right from the beginning of Acts, doesn't mean necessarily its final form is completed, because the testimony we had from the early church is that he is the one that first starts, that he's a note taker and so on. So if they're first being generated within that context, then a lot of the details would be remembered by people, because an awful lot of them would have connections, and there would be discussions and things going on, and so in actual fact you can kind of explain the same phenomena but almost with total different kind of perspectives. So anyway, just flagging that as a kind of an approach to how you kind of unpack these things, because there are some things in here, you see, that Matthew kind of leaves out. But if you look at some of the other Gospels, they start to kind of play in. So in particular, you see, for over 1,000 years, the church has tended to assume that over here, this place on, oh no, you can't see my, okay, you can't see my mouse, can you, on the thing? Okay. Over where it says Tabgha, between Capernaum and Gennesaret. So Jesus has started, of course. That's actually been the location that has been kind of. There's a Byzantine church there marking the spot where Jesus fed the 5,000, and there's mosaic floor with a basket of bread and fish and so on. The logic is that in Mark's gospel it says that Jesus headed that the disciples then after this. So after this event's finished, they look to cross over, is the phrase, to cross over to Bethsaida, you see. And so the assumption is that if they're having to cross over to Bethsaida, then actually that kind of means cutting across the top. So that was the logic. And so people who traditionally then said, well, actually, although that's the traditional place, it also talks about it being desolate. And as you'll notice on the little map, you've got actually the western side of Galilee, which is where Tabgha is not desolate at all. It's highly, highly populated. So, the whole debate that we have in this passage we're going to look at in a second of where do we get bread is less relevant on the western side, whereas the eastern side is very sparsely populated. There are huge areas where there's nobody living or wouldn't have been anybody living. So there were those that would say, oh, well, actually, no, that doesn't make sense to us. So then what they did was they speculated. So there were advocates, there was the kind of the historic church location for the feeding of the 5,000. Some people, though, advocated they'd obviously got it wrong and that it must be on the east side because that's the desolate side. So they speculated that there was another town called Bethsaida, or that Bethsaida, as we thought we knew it, wasn't in the place we thought it was. And so they actually speculated kind of near Tabgha that there was a little village called Bethsaida, which would then allow Jesus to kind of feed the 5,000 on the eastern coast and then cross over to the western coast towards Bethsaida, you see. Sorry, I should have put the text up because I'm probably being very confusing here as I tell the kind of the story. But actually, both of those things are actually kind of all unnecessary. It's a bit like what I was saying before. If you just understand that little phrase, when we say cross over, to us, crossing over looks like left to right or right to left, because we always think of north as being upwards, if you like. So we always cross over from east to west, because actually we would go up or down if it was north or south in our maps. But of course, the ancient world, they didn't think, on the whole, strangely enough, the key direction tended to be east or west. Most of the world thought of the kind of straight ahead direction as being east, because that's where the sun rose. Whereas west was behind you, except that in Israel they tended to look at that as being their key direction, because the temple kind of ran from east to west, and so on. So in actual fact, the crossing over would tend to imply north to south. And that seems to be much more, as we've kind of done more and more research, you see that actually probably both are possible in the ancient world. But the thing we shouldn't do is impose an east to west. And actually as you see the way that the coast curves down, it actually positions now there's a particular mount and a little slope down where nobody lived, a desolate spot on that little outcrop of rock. Which is directly, in one sense, opposite. You would cross over the bay if you're standing on a beach, not looking from an aerial point of view. So I've got some slides here, some slides of the bay. So you see that where it says the arrival and departure bay. If you can look at the curve, if you're leaving from that beach, Bethsaida is directly across the bay in front of you. You see, so the language actually makes perfect sense. So I think it's quite neat, but it's just kind of highlighting. It's not particularly controversial, Nobody was going on crusades about these things. But it kind of it confirms to me, it's one of those little things that make you think, okay, now I think this is the location where the feeding of the 5,000 happened. So you can see Capernaum and you can see Bethsaida, and you can imagine very, very kind of comfortably heading towards this little outcrop of rock that creates that natural bay. That Jesus has tried to get away into this region because there's nobody really living around there. But they've spotted, people have taken the long walk round, which means he's there first. But while he's there, people start gathering towards him, and the crowd arrives. So when evening had come, his disciples approached him, saying the place is desolate and the hour is already late. Dismiss the crowd so they can go to the villages and buy themselves food. Now, as I said, on the western side, the whole of that region is kind of developed. So there are villages. It's not there aren't villages. It's just not big. We have that interesting little bit. I think it's in John's Gospel where it's Philip who says, where Jesus says to Philip, "Why didn't you get them food?" And actually, of course, we know that Philip comes. Actually, we know from John's Gospel. It's in Luke's Gospel. I think that Jesus asks Philip to help. But we know from John's Gospel that Philip comes from Bethsaida. So he's probably the disciple who comes from the region closest to where they are. He might know the small settlements that are there better, but there's nowhere that's going to be able to feed the 5,000. And Jesus said to them, "Don't you need to go away? But Jesus said to them, sorry, they don't need to go away. You feed them." The actual incident, I think, is so kind of important to the meaning of the story of Jesus, because as we've seen Jesus going up the mountain and delivering the Sermon on the Mount, which has a strong place of resonance with Moses giving the 10 Commandments from the mountain. Jesus gives the 8 Beatitudes from the mountain. And I think I touched on it when we were covering that passage. The actual Deuteronomy actually finishes that when the law is being completed, when it's fulfilled, it would release 8 blessings. It doesn't actually say 8 blessings. It lists 8 ways of being blessed, kind of example ways. You'll be blessed, 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 blessed. And so there's a very kind of clear parallel in Matthew's Gospel between the Sermon on the Mount and the 10 Commandments. And here you get a clear kind of parallel with Jesus acting out, of course, the provision of bread in the wilderness, the provision of bread in a desolate place. So Matthew calls it desolate, Luke calls it desolate. Just trying to think what I'm pretty sure they all refer to it as that. The idea. So you're kind of clearly seeing Jesus in his life, not doing exactly what Moses did, but having these incidents that portray him in a new foundational way. And of course, as we get to things like the Transfiguration, which comes very soon after this in the text, we see that kind of sense of which suddenly there's Moses and there's Elijah and there's Jesus. And Peter kind of equates Moses and Elijah's superiority, and of course the voice from the cloud turns it all upside down. Jesus is superior to the two, but at the same time he's doing things that show how they anticipate him, which feeds into the question which the more I've kind of studied these things and looked at them, the more I'm surprised that it's not become kind of more part of Christian thinking. The occasions through the Gospels where people talk about, "Are you the prophet?" They say it to John the Baptist and so on. Because having just finished, of course, I should have said that. I actually at the weekend the draft for Jesus in the Wilderness went off to my publisher. So now they've got the tricky job of trying to fit too many words into a fixed format. But we'll negotiate that as it goes. But having just finished that, there are so many ways in which you see these events in Jesus' life that kind of parallel Moses as a covenant creator. And of course, we have the whole New Testament. We call it the New Testament because it is a new covenant. But actually, it's not one of those. And that was really tied up with the prophetic character of the prophet who followed Moses. So Moses had prophesied towards the end of Deuteronomy that there'll be a prophet after me who speaks with God's voice, and you should listen to him. Which is why on the Transfiguration the voice says, "This is my son, listen to him," because he is that character. So it's not that it's not there in the Gospels. It's just that the Gospels are assuming probably we understand some of that, which we've forgotten about. So there's something very kind of strongly, which I think all four of the Gospels put it in there, where this particular miracle, this particular thing, one, it is a big crowd, obviously. But the provision of bread in a desolate place, which then is like the way that Moses did those things, is because something about the ministry of Jesus is fulfilling not just the promised king, the Messiah, but also the promised prophet after Moses, who would establish this new covenant. He's giving the 8 blessings that were anticipated in Deuteronomy. The voice out of the cloud is saying, listen to him, just like Moses said when he comes, listen to him, because he is God's voice. And we've looked at, if you do some of the Old Testament things I do, that the God's voice is not just a sound, it's a kind of a personality, it's a character. And here he is providing bread in the wilderness, of course. So yeah, that, as I said, we've only got a few verses, so I'm kind of putting out the background to those things. So Jesus says to them, you don't need to go away, you feed them. As we put that together with the other Gospels, so Mark and Luke, they give us a little bit more detail. That it's not instant. He then goes on and asks, so they told him, we have 5 loaves and 2 fish. I think Mark's Gospel says they after they'd found out, so they obviously go and ask around who's got something. And someone comes back with the 5 loaves and 2 fish, and we know it's a young lad and so on. So he said, bring them here to me. And when he'd instructed the crowds to sit down on the grass, taking the loaves and the 2 fish, he looked up to heaven and spoke a blessing, which is what the Greek literally says. I think my Bible said he blessed the bread, but it's just he spoke a blessing. Then he broke the loaves, and he gave. So they take the word loaves here and they join it with the blessing. But I preferred the break. I think he spoke a blessing. He's kind of, thank you, Lord, want to bless all of these things, not just the bread. Then he broke the loaves, gave them to the disciples, and the disciples to the crowd. And everyone ate and was satisfied, and they collected up leftover fragments, 12 handbaskets full. And those fed were about 5,000 men, besides the women and children. So, I've seen estimates that kind of range from 8 to about 15,000. Are there as many as women and as many children? In which case we've got 15. So more than 5,000, as we know. I just the kind of the miracle story. Again, it's just one of those things. I know so many different. Over the years, growing up where I did, I'd meet people coming out from mission fields all over the place, and stories of multiplying food are actually not that uncommon in mission circles. And I always just like to kind of throw it out, because it's not that suddenly they stand back and watch things growing on the table. It never seems to happen that way. They just never quite know, They knew they had like one bowl of chicken pieces. I'm just thinking of one particular story, one bowl of chicken pieces, and yet about 200 people got served out of it. And they're thinking, you can't fit 200. It's the kind of almost after the event going to think out, if we'd had 200 chicken pieces, then how we'd have had to have 3 bowls, but we only had one. We just kept on serving up what we had, and it kept on going. And so those kinds of stories, they're quite kind of almost amusingly. And if we have the wrong kind of approach to our faith, we want to prove to the world that doesn't want to believe by the miracle that they can't deny. And it would be lovely, wouldn't it, if you could go, hang on everybody, stand back, watch this, pray over the food, and suddenly bing bing bing, there were chicken legs popping up all over the place. It never quite seems to happen that way, but somehow it's in the process of trying to do what isn't really possible, but in a place of faith, and so people can kind of come from streams that aren't super charismatic and don't believe in all of the, but somehow God did this. We're not quite sure where it came from. And and sometimes there's provision via unusual routes, but sometimes it really is. It's kind of, well, we just kept on serving it. It seemed to last, and we're not quite sure as we look back on it. Just trying to think of another. Yeah. Anyway, so in many ways, as I said, it's a very short passage, and but it's such a kind of big one. I thought, well, I don't want to kind of move on too quickly. So I'm going to give space if anyone wants to ask any questions or make any observations. For me, it's one of the linchpin events in Jesus' life and ministry. But in a strange way, it's one of those things we can spin off and take forever spinning off from. But let's just kind of keeping the focus on it today. Does anyone want to ask anything or make any comments or observations that you have on that passage?
Just wanted to ask about the leftovers,
Yeah.
And what significance you see in the 12 baskets.
Yeah, 12. So I've left the word small baskets in or hand baskets, the 12 hand baskets, because the next ones are, in the feeding of the 4,000. Are bigger baskets. It's a really good question to ask, Barbara, because I do know that people have kind of commented on the numbers here that because it's 7 baskets next time, so the numbers change, and of course Jesus makes the reference then in Mark's Gospel, looking back at the 2 incidents, and said, didn't you understand what was going on? But as I'm sitting here right now, I can't quite pull those things out of my head. But I kind of so I know there's the possibility, I guess, this first feeding is actually this is worth mentioning, of course, is we know that this event is close to Passover. So by this time of year, because it's spring, which again we get that from Mark's Gospel, because the grass is green. So he sit down on the green grass, and the grass is green only at the beginning of spring. As soon as it starts to warm up, it dries out, you see. So it's not just that they're sitting on grass, but it's grass while it's green. Then John's Gospel says it's just before Passover, so that all fits, all these little different ways of kind of saying the same thing. And during that period, of course, there are huge numbers of pilgrims beginning to head down and into the lands of Judea and Galilee, ready to start heading towards Jerusalem for the Passover. But the thing that's interesting is they would be heading around the west coast. So this is one of those. This is where the difference on which coast it is comes into play in terms of it. Not that it changes whether it could have happened or not. It changes the dynamic, because what you have is almost the obvious route that people would make. They are diverting, because the eastern coast is really a non-Jewish area, which is why when Jesus crosses over, if you remember, and delivers the Gadarene demoniac on that side, there are pigs, because it's not a particularly Jewish area; it's much more Gentile, and there's the Roman legion is stationed nearby, and so on. So the fact that people were so motivated to kind of follow around the wrong direction, down the Gentile side, rather than kind of heading down the routes where there's lots of support for pilgrims on their way, for the right price, of course, on their way down towards Jerusalem, seems to be significant. That this is a Jewish community who are taking the wrong side. They're going down the wrong side in many ways. There's some real effort to come and follow Jesus down here. Whereas if it was the other side, well, that's much more natural. So as I say, I'm not quite sure how that all fits together. But what I have heard, I have heard kind of the difference made. For 12 being symbolic of Israel with its 12 tribes. The second feeding event is the feeding of the 4,000, and that seems to be in more Gentile areas. It's the area that seems to be impacted by the people come from that region, whereas here Jews are coming round from the north into the Gentile area to be fed into the desolate area. The second time, it's not that far away, but people are coming up from the surrounding villages, so they tend to be Gentiles. And I remember long time ago hearing Martin Goldsmith make a contrast. If anyone remembers Martin, who was a Jewish convert to Anglicanism, that there was something symbolic about the numbers there, but I can't remember it now. So, so sorry, Barbara. I just have to say, yeah.
No problem.
Would anyone else remember that? Anyone? Can't think now. I'm sure.
My question would be, where did they get the hand baskets from?
Yeah, that's a good. Yeah, well, they I guess they could be in the boat. There are villages there, but just not. They're not big ones, you know. So there must be some
Not
folks
the sort of
around.
thing people would carry with them, Kristen.
I guess the lad with his bread and fish in the basket may have had, but yeah. Yep. Well, as I said, it is one of those I think we'll never really be able to answer. We do know that there are surrounding villages, but they're just not they're just not big. They're not large populations that could take, you know. It's worth remembering, you know, that when we talk about a village, you know, we could be talking about 20 people, and you got 5,000. That's not going to, they're not going to be able to feed them, but they may well have 12 hand baskets. You know. They often sometimes they'll say the average size of a village globally is about 150 to 200 people. I've heard that used by sociologists. That once you get over 200, you're talking about a small town. So if you use the phrase village, so there are surrounding villages, just not big towns.
And what do you think they did with the leftovers?
Good question. Fish doesn't keep so long, does it? One of the things I do wonder, just as a serious thing, is if he bought the fish with him, and it's probably been dried and cured. If he's bought them as lunch, rather than unless he's caught them, he's been sitting on the beach and caught the fish as well. But I don't think he'd be able to catch bread. Yeah. So,
It's a huge number of people.
yeah, and I suspect, as I say, you know, people will be coming down for so they, you know, the route that they would take over the top and down Syria would naturally kind of drop down to the top of the Sea of Galilee. It's just it would naturally bend round the Jewish areas on the west side. So where things start is in the interim between Bethsaida and Galilee, in that northern area. So people could be crowding up round there. It's just that they've detoured round to the east. It's not a particularly profound observation. It's just a kind of something to throw in. So as I say, for me, one of the most encouraging little things out of it is just of saying it's not uncommon, that story to hear of. It's one of the things you can't kind of bank on, but sometimes when it's really needed, the provision comes.
Yeah, friends of ours used to be in community in a large house, and some some very enthusiastic people in church used to invite all sorts of people round. And Janet often talks about the way in which the food was multiplied.
Yeah.
She would be like, I don't know how we managed to feed
Well,
that many
no.
people.
No.
That's testimony, really.
That's right, and you hear the story when I remember talking to someone, you know, talking about the chicken pieces, saying, well, we had a pot of chicken pieces, and then we had suddenly we had an extra kind of extra numbers of hundreds of people to feed, and we just figured, well, let's just keep serving until it's all gone, and then we'll just have to say sorry. But then at the end of it, it's kind of hang on, how many people have gone through? So yeah, I think, and you know, I think I remember similar kind of stories with George Muller, you know, which is who's right there in kind of in good solid Brethranism, isn't he? So the kind of the roots, the evangelical roots there. So
And Heidi Baker as well.
yeah, that's right. No, there's certainly stories from Mozambique on those kind of things. But yeah, I can remember when I way back when I did some courses at the Fuller School of World Mission. I remember I remember one of the lecturers there was just saying, you know, there isn't a miracle. So when you look at the mission, the world mission scene, there isn't a miracle in the New Testament you can't track down in the last few years, and that's just a kind of continuous cycle. In a place where, because the U.S. Center for World Mission used to be centered just next to the Fuller Seminary, so it was used to get and when I was there, that was one of the things I noticed. You'd always have missionaries passing through, and there'd always be stories, and so they were circulating around in the in that kind of conversation. He was just saying, you know, if you're based around here, and you're just talking and hearing those things, you start to realize very quickly that it never takes more than a few years worth of history before you can find pretty much every miracle you can think of in the New Testament being reported back by credible sources. You know, so. And I find it, the weird thing is, maybe you forgive me for putting it this way, because I find it kind of encouraging that it's not kind of just every week somewhere. So these things genuinely are miracles, but because there's an interesting tension which I think is really fundamental to kind of our well-being side of sense, which is that the testimony of Scripture is that humanity is supposed to be growing into something, and you don't help a child grow into who they need to be if you do everything for them that's difficult for them. So so I actually kind of see I see a kind of connection, because I've thought about this. You know, obviously I got healed from cancer. And I'd look back at various kind of points in history, and you'd hear there'd be stories of people getting healed of tuberculosis, and then suddenly, there were breakthroughs in medical science on those things. That there's a kind of almost a sense in which the power of certain things gets disrupted by the miracle, but then there's a place for human beings now to step into. So the Father is demonstrating heart and what the truth should be, what's possible. And then then we're supposed to fill in and grow into something, and that's part of that sense of and that's why I quite like it that way. That God's made a world which is evident for those who seek Him, but He's not so in your face that if you don't want to believe in, you can't avoid it. So it's a kind of a grace that means we're not compelled to believe. We have a certain level of choice, and therefore, if you had the miracles like that happened every week, if we never had to go out. So tonight we have a newcomers' evening at church, and I'm buying the food. So after this, I'm off to Costco to buy a couple of £100 worth of pizzas and sandwiches. Some people would like it if it's no problem, we've got the miracles. I'll just turn up with one pizza, and it costs me a £5. We'll pray over it, multiply it, and there we go. But there is kind of something about the growth in the responsibility, because actually it creates a greater sense of the value when I actually have to use my own money to value them by buying food, if I can put it that way. There you go.
It means we're not spoiled children.
Yeah, exactly. It's good for our growth, and it's therefore it's heading us towards what the Father always wanted from humanity, rather than and I feel really kind of almost bad in saying it this way, because obviously we put such a strong emphasis on the relational side of our faith, which is absolutely fundamental. But the Lord is wanting a relationship with mature humans, if I can use that word. Jesus says, "Be mature like your Father in heaven is mature," though we often translate it as perfect, but the Greek can be mature. But so he'll do to kind of help us on the way, a bit like when I teaching our kids to cycle. I remember we took the stabilizer wheels off Joel's bike, and he cycled for the first time, and then Kezia, who was 2 years younger, she wasn't yet 4. Was so impressed that she insisted on having hers taken off. And the first couple of times I ran holding her the scruff of her neck, while she cycled. And then she told me she didn't want it anymore, and she just did it. But it's that kind of thing of it's fine for the first couple of times for Dad to kind of chase along doing it with you, but actually part of the thing is I want you to grow, and you take the responsibility. You do it your way too. And so when Acts comes, they selling their own goods, and they're sharing food so that no one has need, and then they set up a program to feed the widows and make sure that nobody is being left out. That they're now growing into the possibility they can respond out of their resources too. So, anyway, those are the thoughts. Thoughts for the day. Anything else? Or it's a pretty straightforward one today, I think. So I think it gets more complicated next week. So I have to work out how many incidents we do, because we've got all the whole thing with the storm and so on, don't we? I think, if I remember rightly. And having to turn back, and Jesus walking on water, and so on. So, and then I think we're on to Transfiguration shortly after that. Good. Okay. Well, a bit shorter this afternoon, but thanks for being here, and look out for the recording when it goes up. Did anyone ever rewatch them? Yeah. So some people do watch them who aren't here, so that's always nice to know.
Yes, I want to watch.
Yeah.